Hi, this is Rob Knight from Your Itinerary. I want to invite you to join me and Rick Garrity in the Rocky Mountains this August to explore Colorado's frontier past. We'll shoot trains, ghost towns, and lots of interesting characters along the way. Oh yeah, and the scenery's pretty nice too. Find out more at digitalphotoadventures.com.
Thanks, Rob. And I want to let everyone know that I still have a few openings left for my workshop in Cuba in early November. Just head on over to dougk.com/workshops. Thanks. Hi, this is Doug K, and this is another episode of All About the Gear with my friend Gordon Lang from Brighton, England. How are you, Gordon?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me, Doug. Always a pleasure to see you.
Today we're diving back into Canon land, and I'm tempted to say we're going to talk about 4 different cameras, but in fact, we're going to talk about 2 different cameras. These guys at Canon, I don't know what they're up to, but we're talking about a camera that is the T6i and the T6s in the US, right?
Yeah, in North America, I believe they call them those in Canada as well.
But they call them the 750D and the 760D in other parts of the world, right?
Yeah, in pretty much, I believe, the whole rest of the world, apart from North America and maybe not Japan. In Japan, they call the Rebels the Kisses. So there's probably 3 different names. So 6 different names we're going to be dealing with. Well, 4, because we're not going to be talking about the Kisses. Okay. We'll save all the Kisses for someone else.
All right. And so for background, this camera is in the Rebel line from Canon. And the Rebel, boy, if you go back into the early days of DSLRs, I think the Rebel was probably the first DSLR to come in under $1,000. And because of that, you know, there are people who have been Rebel fans for a long time. It may have been the first camera DSLR that they owned, the first digital camera that they owned. And it's been a very popular line for Canon, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I've spoken to Canon USA about this, and I have had a similar story quoted to me where they'll say people love the Rebel brand so much that they'll go into the shop and say, look, I've got last year's Rebel or 2 years ago's Rebel. Can I have the latest Rebel? So it's an easy way for them to kind of sell that. So even if they did want to change the numbers, they can't really now. They can't really change the branding on that now. But it has become very confusing, especially for anybody who publishes on the internet and wants the best search engine optimization. What name do you call it, and what name do you call it first if you're going to use all of them? So absolutely. I've kind of got into this horrible habit, as you'll discover during this show, of describing it with all the names at once. So I'll probably call it the 760D T6s or the 750D T6i. Or I might just mix it up. I don't know. Let's see how it goes.
All right. Very good. So all right, let's dive into it. Tell me what are the basics about these 2 new cameras?
Okay, so to kind of put it into context, Canon has an entry-level model. At the moment, that's the 1200D or T5, I think it's called in North America. The next model up is what we're talking about now. Now, previously, that was the 700D or T5i in North America. The idea of that, they call it an upper entry-level model. I can't quite call it a mid-range model because that would be something like the 70D in the current lineup. So it's an upper entry-level model that we're talking about here. It's a camera that's designed for people who haven't got a massive amount to spend, but they've got a little bit more than a budget camera, and they're after a little bit more sophistication without the size, complication, and cost of a higher end model. So that is the kind of market that Canon is after with this. However, they've done something completely different for this latest generation and done 2 versions of it. So the basic version is the T6i or 750D. Now, this camera costs about $849 with the 18 to 55 millimeter kit zoom. That's just under £700 in the UK. It's got a new sensor. Canon, for a very, very long time, has been deploying pretty much the same 18 megapixel CMOS sensor. This model now has gone up to 24 megapixels, so it can kind of compete with Sony and Nikon and all the other APS-C class cameras that have all gone to 24 megapixels. So that is the big main difference between it and its predecessor. It's improved the autofocus system. It's now up from 9 point to 19 point. I believe that is the same AF system as the EOS 70D. The metering sensor is new. It's more sophisticated, 7,560 pixels. It's the first Rebel or 3-digit EOS D with built-in Wi-Fi and NFC. So it's really, really nice to see Canon finally doing that. We spoke about the Nikon D5500, which is what this camera goes head-to-head against, which of course also now has Wi-Fi. It's like the DSLR companies, Canon and Nikon, have finally worked out that people do want Wi-Fi on these cameras, and they finally put it into this range. It's several years after all the mirrorless cameras have done it, but at least they're there now. So the first one with Wi-Fi and NFC. Otherwise, the specs are fairly similar. It has a 3-inch articulated touchscreen, same as its predecessor, still 5 frames per second. Video is still 1080p at 25p or 30p, depending on your region. Now, both of these models, because I mentioned that there were two, both of them have the same core specification, right? They're both 24 megapixels, 19-point AF, 1080, 30p, 5 frames per second. Where they differ, though, is Canon has made, and for those who are watching the video, I'm going to hold up the 760D or T6s. This is the higher end model. They've made this slightly more sophisticated. The first thing you'll notice is it has an LCD information screen on the upper right surface of the body. The cheaper 750D or T6i does not have this. What does it do? If I switch on the camera, you'll see it shows basic exposure information like the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. This is a kind of screen that you'll find on some higher end models. It's not necessary because the LCD screens on the back will replicate all that information, but it's a nice little extra. Once we are looking at the back, though, you'll notice this control wheel here. Now, the Rebel line, or the 700D line, didn't have this wheel on the back that you can turn around. You had to go for something like the 70D or a semi-pro model to get this wheel. So Canon thought, hey, this is a nice differentiator to put on this higher-end model. So it now has this control wheel on the back. And it sounds like a really minor thing, but it really is nice to use. I love spinning this wheel. It's one of the nicer ergonomic features of a Canon DSLR. The other major feature is if we have a look at the optical viewfinder, you'll notice a sensor at the top of it, just wedged between the viewfinder and the hot shoe. This automatically turns the screen off when you bring your eye to the viewfinder. These are the three main physical differences between the T6i and the T6s, but there's a couple of smaller things. There's a little basic horizontal leveling gauge in the viewfinder. One of the other differences, I believe, is that the T6s, the 760D, the higher end version, can continuously autofocus in its movie mode. Now, I've heard that the cheaper version, the 750D or the T6i, cannot do that, but I've not been able to confirm that yet. So let's just keep that on the side. And you'll also have to forgive me if I get any of these numbers or names confused. It's very confusing for me. If I'm talking about the cheaper one, I mean the I've almost done it again, T6i or 750D. And if it's the more expensive one, is the T6s or 760D. And at this point, Doug K., I would like to ask you, sir, what is the price difference? How much would you be willing to pay extra for the little screen on the top, the nice control wheel on the back, the little sensor that switches the screen on and off, a little leveling gauge in the viewfinder, and the possibility that it may be able to continuously autofocus in the movie mode? How much extra? What is the premium you'd pay?
All right. Well, I'm going to summarize those once again, just to make sure we get them, because that eye sensor that switches between the LCD and the viewfinder is something, of course, that is standard and basically required on a mirrorless camera, where you have an EVF, an electronic viewfinder, instead of an optical viewfinder. The LCD on the top plate for information, I like it. You know, certainly for a DSLR, I use that all the time on a Nikon. And to point out that thing about the continuous autofocus, now in live view for stills, we know that works. We know that the higher end camera, the more expensive one, does have continuous servo autofocus in live view, and we're just not quite sure about the video mode, right?
No. As far as I understand it, it does. The higher end one has it for stills and video, definitely has it. It's whether the lower end one has it for live view and video. That's the thing I'm not 100% on.
Okay, I believe from the notes that I read that the less expensive one does not have that. But the question is, how much would I be willing to pay? Well, I can tell you what Canon wants us to pay.
No, I want to hear what you'd pay.
Oh, well, would I pay anything?
You know the answer. Just tell me the correct answer.
Oh, I'd probably be willing to spend about an extra $150.
Well, actually, I had a look on Amazon and B&H before we went on air, and it's more like $100 difference.
Well, I was being gracious. That's right.
Oh, right. And in fact, in the UK, it's a bit less. It's about £70 difference in the UK, or about $100 difference. I have played with the 750D or T6i, and I've actually bought the higher end one to do some long-term tests with. And I really like there's a little wheel on the back. You can't underestimate little ergonomic differences, and to me, it just makes it feel like a classier model. I personally would be happy to pay the extra. I think it makes it quite a nicer model, and it'll be very interesting to see which one does sell better and whether one region, prefers one model over the other one. It's quite hard to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, they're exactly $100 difference in the US. But when I was looking at these models and trying to understand which was which, clearly the $100, you're getting a lot more camera for that extra $100. I think it's quite a bit more valuable. But it looked to me like the kit lens offerings were different in that the less expensive one, the T6i 750D, you could buy for $899, maybe a little less, with an 18 to 35 kit lens, but that the more expensive one doesn't have that option. You have on both cameras the more expensive 18 to 135 kit lens. Was that what you've seen also?
Yeah, now this is also dependent on region. In different regions around the world, there will be different kits available. But you're right, in America, and I think pretty much in the UK as well, the cheaper version comes with either the 18 to 55, which is what I've got here. This is just their bog standard kit zoom. Or you can pay a bit extra. In fact, it's not a bit extra, is it? It's like about $200 extra for the 18 to 135, which is quite a physically large lens. It is a big lens, but it has that extra reach on it. The more expensive body, I believe, is not available in this kit with the 18 to 55. I built my own kit because this is the one I wanted with it. So I bought it body only and lens only, and I stuck them together because it worked out the same price. But generally speaking, if you're buying it in the kit, the more expensive version, the T6s or the 760D, will be available body only or with the 18 to 135. And the 18 to 135, as I said, it is quite a hefty lens. And at this point, it's probably worth holding up or describing to those listening on the podcast its biggest rival. This is the Nikon D5500, which I still have. And can you see them both there?
Yes, I can.
I'm going to peek in between. Do you like that? If you can't think of a reason to switch from the podcast to the video, I mean, right now, this is just awesome framing that I'm doing here. I'm sandwiched between two DSLRs, which are pitched at the same point. And what's the most obvious difference between them, Doug?
Well, that D5500 looks tiny by comparison.
Yeah, it does look a lot smaller now. The body isn't actually that much smaller. The big difference is the lens. Now, Nikon has developed, they both got 18 to 55 millimeter focal lengths. Both have an f3.5 to 5.6 focal ratio. Both have optical stabilization. The big difference is the Nikon is a collapsing design. This allows the lens to shrink when not in use. You just kind of keep twisting the barrel around and it gets smaller. Canon haven't done that. And I'm going to show you an even more extreme version of this. This is the ever-present Sony a6000, which is a mirrorless camera. And you can see this is even smaller. I'm going to describe it for those listening. The body is not only smaller, but the kit lens is tiny. In fact, the kit lens mounted on the Sony a6000 is about as thick as the Canon body alone, without any lens mounted on it. Now, when you look at these cameras together, you may think Canon has become very old-fashioned here because it's the only one of these three main brands that doesn't have a collapsing kit zoom. And as a consequence, it's a big camera. It's a hefty kit to carry around. But what I have noticed in my quality tests when I've been comparing these is the Canon kit lens is a lot sharper in the corners than the Nikon kit lens. And the Nikon kit lens is a lot sharper in the corners than the Sony kit lens. So the more they shrink these lenses, there is some optical compromise at play. And the simple fact is, as Scotty used to say, you can't change the laws of physics. You know, if you want a lens to perform well, it's quite hard to make it small.
Yeah, I can attest to the weakness of that Sony kit lens on the Alpha 6000 because when I got my first Alpha 6000, I got that kit lens and I immediately sold it. It's a quite disappointing lens, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it fulfills its task, which is to make it small. It's
Yeah.
a zoom lens that's very small, and that's what Sony needed. You know, they produced this tiny body and they needed a tiny lens to go with it, because lest we forget, they actually had a non-collapsing 1855 which launched their mirrorless lineup with the Next 3 and Next 5 back in the day. And that was a big lens. And everyone was like, look at the size of the body. And then you put the lens on it. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Slightly less compelling.
So just to summarize the price difference, the lowest price here, US, is about $750 roughly for the less expensive camera with no lens. The most you're going to spend is go to the more expensive camera with the big kit lens, the 18 to 135, and spend about $1,200. So there's quite a range here of kits depending on what you do. But the other thing is, as you said, it's a fairly hefty camera, and it's a camera really, like you said, it was mostly lens, but this is a camera for somebody who wants a big camera. This is not a small mirrorless camera. This really is a DSLR, and it's not even one of the smallest ones that's out there. Okay, a couple of other things. I want to go back to talk about the autofocus, because this is an area that I think they've improved a bit. You know, I think we've both been impressed with the autofocus, the new dual pixel autofocus from the 70D, for example.
Yeah,
pretty nice. Now, let's be really clear here. There are two autofocus systems in these cameras because it's a DSLR. There's the phase detect autofocus that we're used to using in still mode, and then there's the sensor-based, the image sensor-based autofocus that comes in with live view and video. And the improvements here, I guess, well, the 19 point is really the phase detect still autofocus, right?
Yeah, through the optical viewfinder.
Right.
So concentrated in a small diamond in the middle of the frame.
Right. And then if you are in video mode or in live view mode, then of course you're using the image sensor for autofocus. And this is an area where Canon's actually made quite a bit of improvements in their product line, haven't they?
Yeah. Now, the way you always used to do it when you were focusing with the sensor was to use a contrast-based system, which would shift the lens blindly one way and then the other way until it could maximize the contrast of the edge of something. And when you maximize the contrast on the edge of something, it is actually coincidentally in focus. So that's how a contrast-based system works. The problem with a contrast-based system is that, well, one of the problems in the early days was that they weren't very quick. And Canon and Nikon still can't make the contrast-based system that fast, although it's not been a problem for Olympus and Panasonic on the mirrorless side, because their contrast-based system is like that. It's incredibly quick. But one of the other problems that faces them, whether it's fast or slow, is that it doesn't know what direction to go in. So what it does is it starts turning the focusing. If the contrast is reducing, it goes, oh, I've got it wrong already. I've got to quick, go the other way, go the other way. Eventually, it works out which way it's got to go, and it keeps the contrast is getting higher and higher. And then it goes past the point, the perfect point, and then realizes it's gone too far because that contrast has peaked and it's going back down again. So then it knows it's got to reverse, and then it overshoots it again, and it goes, well, I'm pretty sure where it is now. And this hunting back and forth takes time and is visually distracting if you're using it for a movie. You know, it's going back and forth, and everyone's looking at that instead of the subject. So some bright spark somewhere said, you know what, is there any way we can do phase detect autofocus on the imaging sensor itself? And they realized that if you devoted some of the pixels permanently to become phase detect AF points, you could do that. So we started seeing the first mirrorless cameras and DSLRs with embedded phase detect AF points. Canon's system is called a hybrid AF. Now, on these cameras, it's now on version 2, so it's a little bit better than the 700D or T6i, but it doesn't cover the whole frame. There's quite a border around it where it won't focus using this phase detect system. But if you're within that area, it becomes very confident, and it will stop as soon as it's in focus, and it just works very well. Now, Canon has a more sophisticated system, which you mentioned, called dual pixel CMOS AF, currently only featured in 2 bodies, at least 2 DSLR bodies, the EOS 70D, which is what it made its debut on, and the EOS 7D Mark II. Now, this is very, very clever. First of all, well, what they worked out is that there's no need to compromise your sensor by permanently switching one of its pixels or several of its pixels to perform phase detect AF duties. They actually worked out a way in which you can turn any of the pixels on and off between autofocus and imaging. So they can turn the whole sensor into an autofocus system and then turn it back again when they want to take the picture. So this is the holy grail. And it also means that they can use virtually the whole sensor area. So you get a massive coverage of autofocusing capabilities and no compromise, because as soon as it takes the picture, it says, right, switch them all back into imaging points. Now, I don't know how much this costs, but I do know that they've not deployed it on anything cheaper than the 70D. And unfortunately, these models here, the T6s and T6i, 750D, 760D, don't have dual pixel CMOS, but they do have hybrid AF2, which is almost as good. It's not quite as good, as I said. It doesn't quite cover the whole area. It doesn't seem to be quite as confident, but it's still pretty good. So Canon has kind of nailed that, and that's one of the big differences between this camera and the Nikon D5500, because the D5500 is still contrast-based in live viewing for movies, and for movie AF, it just doesn't cut it, whereas this camera can. Okay,
but let's get realistic about one thing here. We talk a lot about these image sensor-based systems in DSLRs. We talk about, again, the contrast-based autofocus, the hybrid systems, the dual pixel, and the higher-end EOS cameras. Obviously, when you're shooting video, you're in live view mode all the time. But let me ask you a question. When you're actually just shooting as opposed to doing reviews, do you ever use live view except maybe on a tripod? I mean, you're out there taking pictures. How often does somebody actually use live view as their normal mode of shooting, a still picture?
Well, actually, I used it today, just a couple of hours ago. Now, obviously, when you're shooting mirrorless, you're shooting live view all the time. But I assume you meant with the DSLR,
correct,
right?
Correct.
When do you shoot stills with a DSLR? Well, the first example is the one you gave. When you're mounted on a tripod and you want to use the benefit of, say, magnification to ensure that your focus is spot on and to view the composition as it's going to be captured. Now, I was taking a picture today of the Brighton Pavilion, which is a beautiful building in Brighton, and I was using the new 50mm f1.8 STM lens, which mounted on this camera becomes 80mm. So it's a short telephoto, it's quite tight. And when you're used to taking pictures of the same buildings around the same town, you know exactly what focal length is going to produce what composition. And I know when I'm shooting at about 80mm that this building has got two towers on it, two little kind of peaks on it, that if you don't line them up perfectly, it looks really annoying on the picture. If one is a little bit more to the side than the other, you've got to get this absolutely symmetrical. So I was trying to frame this with the optical viewfinder, and I just couldn't get it right. And the reason was because the optical viewfinders on these cheaper DSLRs do not give you 100% coverage. It's more like 95%. There's a little border all the way around it that you don't capture. So when you look at your pictures on the screen, you're like, well, I've actually captured more than I thought. I was a bit tight on that shot through the viewfinder, but it's actually a bit wider. And it's not always a pleasant surprise, because sometimes it reveals that you weren't quite as lined up as accurate as you thought. So what I did when I was shooting this building today was I did switch into live view. I was still shooting handheld, and I used the grid overlay in live view. Now, there is a grid through the viewfinder as well, but the benefit of doing it in live view is that I was getting 100% coverage, so I could line it up much more easily. And the other benefit of shooting in live view, which again I deployed today, is this Canon camera and the Nikon D5500 both have fully articulated screens, and they're both touch sensitive as well. So I was able to hold the camera high over my head and angle the screen down for a kind of squarer on composition, so the building wasn't angling in. I wasn't at the bottom pointing it up at it. I was able to have the camera square onto the building or squarer onto the building and produce a nice result. So yes, I do use live view on DSLRs handheld, but it can be a funny experience at times. It's not as slick as a 100% live view mirrorless system.
Now, if you were going out and shooting moving subjects, your children, for example, would you be likely to use that in live view mode or with the optical viewfinder? Now,
well,
let's be more specific. Let's say you wanted to put this into your 5 frame per second burst mode. Then what mode were you most likely shoot in?
Well, the 5 frames per second speed is only supported when shooting through the optical viewfinder. So if you want to shoot at the top speed with the DSLR, you will be shooting with the optical viewfinder, not in live view. Also, the continuous autofocus may work in live view on the Canon cameras due to their hybrid AF system, but it's quite a leisurely process. If someone's walking towards you, think about the speed of somebody walking down the aisle when they're getting married, that sort of speed. Deliberate, but not fast. It'll have a good go at tracking that. But if you're going any faster, if you've broken into a sprint or a canter if you're a horse or something like that, then it's not going to do it in live view on these DSLRs. Not yet. It's just not quite fast enough. So if I was shooting any kind of motion with a DSLR, I would not be doing it in live view. I would be doing it with the optical viewfinder. Although, as you and I and the listeners and viewers of this show know, the technology does exist for live view to continuously autofocus as fast as you need it to do for action. We've seen it. Sony's got it on the A6000 and the A5100. Fuji has it in the middle of the X-T1 and the new X-T10. It's coming out. Panasonic and Olympus got their own technologies, but they're getting better and better. It is possible to continuously autofocus quickly on a moving subject in live view. It's just that the DSLRs can't quite do it yet. And I do wonder whether Canon and Nikon are maybe not developing this as far as they could to try and encourage people to still use the optical viewfinder, which is, of course, the only real benefit a DSLR has over a mirrorless system. As soon as you think, actually, I don't need that anymore, or I'm not going to use that anymore, or the live view is good enough, then you stop using it, and suddenly that DSLR has very few advantages over a mirrorless camera, if any. So I wonder whether they hobble it.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just speculation.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the problems of using a DSLR that has live view is that now you've got these two modes, and you've got to sort of be familiar with both and decide which one to use when. One of the advantages of mirrorless is you only have one mode to live with, which makes it a little.
And you're familiar with the overlays as well, because they can be exactly the same in the viewfinder as they are on the screen. If you've got a little histogram that's live in the bottom left corner, that could be the same on the screen as in the viewfinder. So it's nice to have that consistency.
I find it ironic that one of the scenarios for using live view is to put the camera on a tripod and focus manually. When you can zoom in and get very accurate focusing. The most accurate focusing, in fact, is with live view because you're actually looking at the image itself. But on the other hand, when you manually focus, you're not taking advantage of all these supposedly great features that the cameras are offering us in autofocus.
And still, these DSLRs that we're talking about here at this level don't have focus peaking, which is another focusing aid that is so useful in live view. So if you magnify and you have focus peaking, which basically highlights the edges of objects when they're in focus, that makes things very, very easy. And Doug, I've just remembered another occasion this week again when I used this camera in live view for taking a still photo. It again was when I was testing the 50mm lens as a portrait lens. It was a friend of mine in the cafe that I go to in Brighton, and I wanted to use the face detection because I'm a big fan of face detection. That's face as in the thing that's on the front of your head, as opposed to phase, which is an AF system. So when you're using face detection, you're relying on the camera to identify the eyes first. I think it looks for the eyes and the nose and the shape, and then of course it draws a square around the face. And it then can focus on it wherever it is on the frame. And I really like that because it means I don't have to do the old point at them, focus, keep the shutter release half pressed and then recompose. Or I don't have to move the AF area so that there's an AF point over an eye. I'm using the face detection to actually do that for me. And that works best in live view. So I was shooting portraits in live view, but there's because of the way the shutter works on the DSLR, because it's closed and then it's open and then it's closed again and then it has to open again, there's a lot of clicking involved when you're in live view and you actually take that picture. So you need a very cooperative subject. It is not a technique I would have used for portraits of my kids. I would have definitely switched to the optical viewfinder for that.
Very good. Okay, so you compared this already to, in some extent, to the Nikon D5500, also the Sony Alpha 6000, which we think might be replaced in the near future or upgraded.
It has to be, doesn't it? But it's still a cracking camera.
Oh, just terrific camera. But I think Sony it's been so successful for them. I think they're afraid to replace it because it's just a killer camera. But what I want to do is ask you about image quality. And how would you compare the image quality of what you've seen from these two Canons to the Nikon and the Sony, for example, or any other APS-C cameras that would be appropriate?
Well, at the point that we made this video, this podcast, I've not done an in-depth analysis yet. I will, by the time it's shared online, you'll be able to see an image quality comparison between the Canon and the Nikon D5500 at cameralabs.com. I will have that ready. I'm working on that as we speak. Looking at it right now, I've had a casual look at it. They're very, very similar, to be honest. You have to do quite a little bit of pixel peeping to notice much difference between them. And then what you do notice boils down more to image processing and what lens you're using. I found the most striking difference between them when using the kit zooms, again, was that in the middle of the frame, they were delivering very similar degrees of detail. At the edges and the corners of the frame, the Nikon kit zoom was becoming very soft compared to the Canon. That was remaining nice and crisp. And as we discussed earlier, that's even more noticeable when you switch to, say, the Sony a6000 with its even smaller 16 to 50 millimeter kit zoom, because of course all three of these cameras have got the same size sensor and the same resolution sensor now. They're not made by the same people, but you've got to deliver a light ray onto this sensor area, and as you're doing this with a smaller and smaller lens that's closer and closer to it, it gets harder and harder. So it's a bit of a shame in a way, but there is no substitute for a great big hefty lens, especially a lens that's engineered for a larger format. None of these are, but if you do have a lens that's designed, say, for full frame use, or when you look at those Zeiss Otus lenses, which are so amazing, I think the reason they're so large is because they're actually medium format lenses. The reason they look so amazing on a full frame 35 millimeter format is because they're actually corrected for a bigger format still. And that's one of the compromises you've got to make. It's difficult to have a small lens for a large format that does have autofocus. So any of those Leica people out there who go, "Oh, I've got a small lens, that's great quality," it's not autofocus.
That's right. Well, this is a good time to mention, as you did, that to get the full review, go to cameralabs.com. By the time this show is published, Gordon will have a complete review. And get to his section on recommendations. It's usually the last tab in his reviews. And there I think you'll get a comparison to the cameras that this is up against, and you'll see which one you like there. Also, as we mentioned, if you're interested in buying this camera or any of the cameras we review here on All About the Gear, also go to cameralabs.com. Click on the buy links there, because every little bit helps us, that's for sure.
Doug, would you like a little bonus feature at the end of this?
I'm glad you asked that. Hey, I've got a note here that maybe there's a bonus feature, because I understand that you've got a new lens in hand.
Yes.
While we're talking Canon, let's talk Canon lenses. Yeah,
the best-selling Canon lens ever was the 50mm f1.8 version 2. This lens is their best-selling lens for one very simple reason. It's dirt cheap. It's about $100. The quality is pretty good, especially if you stop it down to about f4. But here's the crucial thing. It opens to f1.8. Now, if you compare that at about 50mm to f5.6, which is what the kit zoom has to reach, then there is a massive difference in light gathering power. It's suddenly the 50mm 1.8 is a lens you can use in the dark compared to the kit zoom. It's a lens that can blur the background on portraits. And if you mount it on a crop frame body, it becomes equivalent to 80mm on a Canon body, which is perfect for portraits. So when people are buying their second lens after kit zoom, the lens they all Canon owners get, is the 50mm 1.8 version 2. But believe it or not, this lens is 24 years old. 24 years old. I reserved my special 24 years old voice for that. So Canon has just announced the successor, and I've got it right here. This is the 50mm f1.8 STM lens. Now, there's a lot of similarities with this and the previous 1.8 version 2. Both have the same focal length, both have the same focal ratio, both cost about the same. The list price on this is about $130 or about 100 British pounds. It has the same optical construction, same number of elements, but it has a closer focusing distance. It also has more aperture blades, so hopefully it should be able to produce more rounded bokeh rendering effects. It has a smaller filter thread, which may irritate some people. It's now 49mm. But the thing that interested me most of all about this is that it is now an STM lens. Now, in Canon's terminology, STM lenses are the ones that it would recommend to you if you're filming video or you want nice, smooth autofocus in live view. The STM part of it allows the lenses to focus smoothly. Now, if you're anything like me, most of your experience with STM lenses may in fact be with the STM zooms. For example, the 18 to 55mm kit zoom or the 18 to 135. I'm going to show you this right now. This is the 18 to 55mm STM kit zoom. Observe how quickly and quietly this lens focuses. Now, the way I'm going to prove this is just going to go beep, beep, beep. You know how they do that. Here we go. You ready for this?
Ready.
Can you hear it? Can you hear that beep?
No.
Really? Can you hear it focusing?
Oh, I heard something. Yeah, I heard it that time.
That was me clattering the side of my laptop. Now, the important thing is that you shouldn't have heard it focusing because it's virtually silent and it's virtually instant. So I thought, hey, STM's brilliant. STM is like USM, except better in some ways. It seems super quick, super quiet, and super smooth for movies. So I was very much looking forward to that on the new 50mm because the old one made the right racket and was very slow when it was focusing. So imagine my surprise when I mounted the 50mm, which is what I'm doing right now. Always put your lens caps on, front and back. No one likes a dusty lens. So I now have the 50mm 1.8 STM mounted, and I'm going to autofocus. I'm going to hold it towards my microphone. Can you hear that?
Well, we're hearing the beeps. I'm not sure I'm hearing the motor.
I'm going to show you. So this is a treat then for the people who are watching the video as opposed to listening to the podcast. Watch this front element. And while it's doing it, it's going zzz, zzz, zzz. This lens is not fast. I mean, look at the speed at which it's focusing, right?
Yeah.
That is not fast. It's taking about a second and a half to go from one range to the other. And it's going zzz, zzz, zzz while it's doing it. So I thought, have I bought a broken lens here? Where's the STM-ness on this lens, this STM loveliness that you get on the zoom lenses? And it transpires, I looked into this, transpires that there is not one type of STM focusing motor, there are two. In fact, there's three, but I'm not going to go on to the third one. The two main types, gear type and lead or lead type. Basically, one of them is, both of them are very smooth. One of them is very quick and quiet, but large. The other one is not quick, it's not quiet, but it's small. So guess which one this has got? The 50mm 1.8 STM has got the one, because it's quite a compact lens, it's got the one that is small and therefore a bit slow and a bit audible. Whereas the kit zoom, because this is another reason why this lens is so big, is because it's got the larger type, the larger STM focusing motor, the one that's very quick and very, very quiet. And the same applies to the 18 to 135. So there's two different types, which is a bit of a shame because I was really hoping that this new 50mm would share the speed and the silent operation of the STM kit zooms, but sadly it does not. And I'm also reviewing that lens at the same time as the body. So if you go to cameralabs.com, already I've got lots of sample images and results, and by the time this video and podcast is available, hopefully the full review will be finished. So there'll certainly be a lot of information on both the camera and the lens.
Okay, so if that's the case, that there are two different flavors of STM lenses in the Canon line, for other lenses, is there a way to tell the difference? Can you determine, online which is which?
Maybe if you're lucky, one of the Canon websites may list what type of AF motor it uses. I've tried to drill down and find some sort of pattern. The pattern would be size, really. If the lens is small, then it's more likely to have the louder and slower STM motor, and that applies to the prime STM lenses. I believe the 40mm Pancake is also the same. I think the 24mm STM lens is also the same. These have the smaller, so therefore the slightly louder and slower focusing motors. The bigger lenses, the zoom lenses, which are the 18 to 55, the 18 to 135, and the 55 to 250, I think it is. Those three zooms have got the bigger but quieter and quicker version of the STM motor. So I'm just letting you know, because if you've got the 18-55 or the 18-135 and you think, oh, I'm just about to buy my first prime lens, and you go out and buy this 50, you might think, well, hang on a minute, why is it so much noisier and slower than my kit zoom? And that is the reason why.
Okay, so to summarize on this, a couple of points. One is, this is an upgrade to an old lens, optically quite similar, but it's a bargain at $130 US and 100 pounds UK. It is a full frame lens, so you can use it on your Rebel, the cameras that we've been looking at already on this show, but you can also use it on your larger full frame Canons. And as you mentioned, for a lot of people who just get a camera and use only the kit zoom, this is a marvelous, inexpensive second lens, because that, especially on a crop sensor, that 50 millimeter, given the 1.6 crop factor that Canon uses in their sensors, you're going to get the equivalent of an 80 millimeter lens, which is a gorgeous focal length for portraits.
And that f1.8 focal ratio allows you to blur the background really nicely, which is an effect that everybody knows. But a lot of people get frustrated. They buy their first DSLR or mirrorless camera and they think, great, I finally got the camera with lots of control that I always wanted. But because they got the kit zoom, they're frustrated because they can't achieve those out of focus effects that they want. They know they have to go into aperture priority and choose a nice small f number, but their f number is not getting small enough. It's f5.6 when it's zoomed in. They need something that goes a lot smaller in terms of f numbers, a lot larger aperture. And that's what this 50 millimeter brings. And in a way, it seems slightly churlish to complain, as I have, about the focusing sound on it, because around $100, which is what this lens will be discounted to very soon, is a complete bargain for an f1.8 lens on any system. You know, if you're shooting mirrorless, that's the big problem that I keep hearing from people about going for Micro Four Thirds or Sony E or Fuji X. There is no cheap prime lens. There is no dirt cheap 50 millimeter equivalent that's fast. They each have a lens like this, and they're very good quality, but they're really expensive. They're at least double the price. And then Nikon used to be able to match it with its old 50mm f1.8D lens, but of course that doesn't have the focusing built into it that you require for their newer, cheaper DSLRs. So they're encouraging people to buy the AFS 50mm f1.8G, which is still quite cheap, but you're still looking at about $200, aren't you? So it's, you know, it's a lot more expensive than this Canon. That's one of the big advantages of the Canon system, is that they do this dirt cheap 50mm. Indeed, they used to call the old one the what was it, the nifty or thrifty 50. Mm-hmm. You know, this or plastic fantastic. This was the, you know, the dirt cheap lens that really got people's creative juices flowing. Suddenly a lens where they could really control the depth of field very cheaply. And if you close it to f4, the quality is very good, you know, or f5.6, it becomes very, very sharp across the frame. So, you know, it opens up all these different, and that's the lens. That's like the gateway drug to the other ones. It's the one where people go, wow, I love that I've got this control over depth of field now. I love that I've got this fixed focal length also that's forcing me to recompose with my feet instead of just standing still and zooming in and out. It's forcing me to move around. I'm getting better quality, better compositions. Again, that control over depth of field. Hang on, I think I'm going to buy another lens now. It's the one that sells the people onto lots of other lenses in the system.
Yeah. And, you know, another scenario for this is if you have a DSLR and you've got a kit zoom and you're out there, you're doing travel photography or family photography in the daytime, and now all of a sudden you've got to step into an interior and you want to take some photographs using the available light in interior. This lens, compared to those kit zooms, gives you at least 3.5 stops more light.
Which is massive. I mean, that's massive. If you think every stop is allowing you to double the shutter speed or half the ISO, you know, doing that again and again and again and again a little bit more, that's a massive difference. It's like instead of shooting at 800 ISO, you're shooting at 100 ISO or something like that.
And the other thing is that gives the camera more light for autofocusing, so that in theory, if you step indoors with your f5.6 zoom, or you zoom in, you're down to f6.3 or whatever it's going to be, the camera says, I don't have enough light to autofocus. You put on your fast 50 at f1.8, and now you can probably autofocus.
Absolutely. No, it's brilliant. It really is one of the no-brainers in the catalog. So it's nice to see it updated. It would have been nicer if it had silent focusing now, but you know, for $100, you can't have everything. It's still a very cheap, affordable way to get into really creative photography.
Well, very good. Hey, before we wrap up, let's just go back to the T6i and T6s, or as they are sometimes known, the 750D and the 760D. Gordon, I know you haven't finished your review yet, but if you had to say, who's this camera for? Let me give you that challenge. Is this an entry-level camera? Is this an upgrade for anybody? What do you think the purpose of these cameras would be?
Okay, it would only be, if you've already owned a DSLR, it would only be an upgrade if you've got a model that's a few years old. I can't see people upgrading from an entry-level model to one of these because it's only a small step up from that. This model is really aimed at people who are buying their first sophisticated camera, their first interchangeable lens camera, but they want something that's going to last them longer than a real budget model. They've got a little bit more to spend. They're willing to put a bit more effort into learning how it works and getting the reward of that as well. So this camera is aimed at people, again, who want to step up from an entry-level model. They're probably upgrading their photography side of things from, say, a phone or a point and shoot. And they just like they've opted for a DSLR because they like the way that it looks and feels. It's got a nice big grip on it. It's very comfortable. I like mirrorless cameras that are smaller, but they're not as comfortable to hold as a bigger camera. And so if you're a bigger person with bigger hands, it's a nice thing to hold. So that's who it's aimed at. But if you are looking at this camera, do also look at the Nikon D5500 and also look at those mirrorless cameras at around the same price point. Again, the Sony a6000 is the one to beat in this category. But, for DSLR, I really enjoy using the T6s, and I would sooner get the T6s over the T6i. I think it's worth paying the extra for that control wheel on the back, the information screen on the back, things like that, the eye sensor, because I do use live view a lot. So switching back and forth between the optical viewfinder and the screen, it's nice to have it switch off automatically.
Well, very good, Gordon. Thank you once again. I want to encourage everyone, go to cameralabs.com. You'll find Gordon's really detailed review of this camera and all the others, sample images, lots of technical information, and his all-important conclusions. And if you're interested in purchasing this or any of the cameras that Gordon reviews, go to cameralabs.com and click on the links there. Gordon, thank you once again for a terrific episode.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure as always.
Okay, bye-bye.